A dangerous weapon. The young man had such a small reddish beard. I always think of him when I see such a beard, and I shudder. He was well dressed, and had obviously chosen his clothes carefully that morning. He was lying there moaning slightly. There was a trickle of blood coming from his left ear. I think his eyes would have been blue if I had been able to look into them, but there was a broad gash over them running right across the right lip, and maybe just missing his left eye by a fraction as it continued up into his forehead. I was only asked to try to take 2 X-ray pictures of his head instead of the usual 4. I took his head in my hand to put him in position for the first one, which would almost inevitably show a fracture of the base of his skull, since he was bleeding from his ear. I remember distinctly the sensation of bone sliding over bone. He had borrowed his father's car that morning, driven it along a country lane at top speed, had just missed a bend and the bridge which followed it, and landed down in the river. The ophthalmic surgeon said perhaps his left eye could be saved. The neurosurgeon said perhaps he would not be a complete cabbage. But I said a prayer of thanks because he died quietly that night. There was a great excitement at the hospital on the 3rd day after a 19-year-old boy had been brought in. He had shattered his femur badly when his motorcycle fell on top of him. He hadn't fractured his skull because he was wearing a helmet, but as he jerked to a halt, he must have dislocated his neck. For when he was brought in, he had lost sensation in his arms and legs. The doctors had gone through the routine of putting him into traction, trying to stretch his neck in the hope that if some pressure was taken off his spinal cord, there would be some recovery. We had trundled our X-ray machine along to the ward, and in spite of all the appliances surrounding him, had managed to take a side view of his neck and leg. There was great excitement later in the day when the boy reported that his hands and feet were tingling. Perhaps the damage was not irreparable. Some feeling was returning. There was hope that he would not be paralyzed for the rest of his life. Everyone began to rejoice, but that night a fat embolism, which had slipped into his bloodstream from his shattered leg, blocked a vital artery and ended our hopes abruptly. "They want someone to do an X-ray in the mortuary," said the boss when we were sipping our tea. "You slip along," he said to me. "After all, you are married." I wasn't quite sure what this had to do with it, and I must add he had never met my husband. But I went along, pushing my portable machine in and out of lifts, and down the very long corridor past the chapel. I was ushered in and shown my customer, an elderly corpse, no more than a worn-out husk, who had served its inmate well. God rest him, no need to get too upset about that. Just pop a film under him, then look for a socket to plug in my machine. I turned round, plug in hand, and then I saw her lying there, a little 10-year-old girl, still and white. I just looked long enough to see there were bruises on her head. I never found out how she came to be knocked down. Perhaps she had run out into the street without giving the driver a chance to avoid her. Or perhaps he had careered along too fast, out of control, maybe drunk at the time, I just don't know. Why do I tell you this? I remember an Exeter girl once telling me just before she left that she would return at the first opportunity in a red open sports car with a cigarette dangling out of the end of her mouth. "You do that," I said. "We shall be glad to see you all the same, but just drive carefully." "Don't worry," she eventually returned safely. "I will spare you." In a few weeks' time, some of you will have in your hands one of the most lethal weapons of this century. As you turn the wheel or squeeze the handlebars, be neither intoxicated with the thrill of speed nor in any other fashion. remember my sad tales. To our own rusting model I am very attached, and yet I have had some very troubled moments in its company. I haven't the willpower to restrict my use of it greatly, but would welcome legislation perhaps speeded up by the oil crisis, which curtailed my right to rush around in it. Until these laws are passed and restore some peace, quiet, and safety to the town and countryside, do not rejoice too much in your machine. Master it, do not become its slave, and approach it soberly.